International organizations. Defending and protecting the American people and advancing their interests requires the United States to engage in a broad spectrum of bilateral and multilateral relationships, including participating in international organizations. Working with other governments through international organizations like the United Nations, the UN, can be tremendously useful, but membership in these organizations must always be understood as a means to attain defined goals rather than an end in itself. Engagement with international organizations is one relatively easy way for the U.S. to defend its interests and to seek to address problems in concert with other nations, but it is not the only option. And American diplomats should be clear eyed about international organizations' strengths and weaknesses. When such institutions act against U.S. interests, the United States must be prepared to take appropriate steps in response, up to and including withdrawal. The manifest failure and corruption of the World Health Organization, WHO, during the COVID-19 pandemic is an example of the danger that international organizations pose to U.S. citizens and interests. The next administration must end blind support for international organizations. If an international organization is effective and advances American interests, the United States should support it. If an international organization is ineffective or does not support American interests, the United States should not support it. Those that are effective will still require constant pressure from U.S. officials to ensure that they remain effective. Serious consideration should also be given to withdrawal from organizations that no longer have value, quietly undermine U.S. interests or goals, or disproportionately rely on U.S. financial contributions to survive. The Trump administration's tough love approach to international organizations served American interests. For example, the Trump administration withdrew from or terminated funding for the United Nations Human Rights Council, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the United Nations Relief and Works Organizations, and the WHO. The results were redeployment of taxpayer dollars to better uses and other organizations getting the message that the United States will not allow itself and its money to be used to undermine its own interests. The Biden administration reversed many of these decisions. Currently, U.S. funding for international organizations is more than $16 billion in fiscal year 2021, a sharp increase from $10.8 billion in fiscal year 2015. Millions of Americans' taxpayer dollars go to support policies and initiatives that hurt the United States and American citizens. The next administration should direct the Secretary of State to initiate a comprehensive cost benefit analysis of U.S. participation in all international organizations. This review should take into account longstanding provisions in federal law that prohibit the use of taxpayer dollars to promote abortion, population control, and terrorist activities, as well as other applicable restrictions on funding for international organizations and agencies with a view to withholding U.S. funds in case of abuses. International organizations should not be used to promote radical social policies as if they were human rights priorities. Doing so undermines actual human rights and weakens U.S. credibility abroad. The next administration should use its voice, influence, votes, and funding in international organizations to promote authentic human rights and respect for sovereignty based on the binding international obligations contained in treaties that have been constitutionally ratified by the U.S. government. It must promote a strict text-based interpretation of treaty obligations that does not consider human rights treaties as living instruments, both within the State Department and within international organizations that receive U.S. funding, including by making respect for sovereignty and authentic human rights a litmus test of personnel decisions and elections processes within international organizations. The U.S. Commission on Unalienable Human Rights focused on the primacy of civil and political rights in its inaugural report, which remains an important guidepost for bilateral and multilateral engagements on human rights. The Commission's report is a roadmap for revamping and re energizing U.S. human rights policy and should be the basis for both structural and policy changes throughout the State Department. All U.S. multilateral engagements must be reevaluated in light of the work of the Commission, and initiatives that promote controversial policies must be halted and rolled back. It is paramount to create a healthy culture of respect for life, the family, sovereignty, and authentic human rights in international organizations and agencies. To support this goal, the U.S. led an effort during the Trump administration to forge a consensus among like minded countries in support of human life, women's health, support of the family as a basic unit of human society, and defense of national sovereignty. The result was the Geneva Consensus Declaration on Women's Health and Protection of the Family. All U.S. foreign policy engagements that were produced and expanded under the Obama and Biden administrations must be aligned with the Geneva Consensus Declaration and the work of the U.S. Commission on Unalienable Human Rights. The U.S. government should not and cannot promote or fund abortion in international programs or multilateral organizations. Technically, the United States can prevent its international funding from going toward abortions, but the U.S. will have a greater impact by including like minded nations and building on the coalition launched through the Geneva Consensus Declaration with a view to shaping the work of international agencies by functioning as a united front. The COVID 19 pandemic made it painfully clear that both international organizations and some countries are only too willing to trample human rights in the name of public health. For example, the WHO was and remains willing to support the suppression of basic human rights, partially because of its close relationship with human rights abusers like the PRC. The next administration should unequivocally embrace the premise that humanity and the international community can simultaneously tackle pandemics and other emergent health threats without impeding the rights of people. It must also become a vocal surrogate for people in countries where rights are being suppressed in the name of health. This will likely require greater restrictions on the supply of federal dollars to the WHO and other health focused international organizations pending adjustment of their policies. The United States must return to treating international organizations as vehicles for promoting American interests, or take steps to extract itself from those organizations.